If I were to show you this tier list, what would you think it's about? How much fun these characters are? How well designed these characters are? Well, actually none of these. You see, Overwatch 2 has a death or a respawn tip system that's been in place really since Overwatch 1. When you die, sometimes on the right side of your screen, you'll see a tip telling you what you could have done better versus the target or what you could do playing the hero itself. And many of these tips were notoriously bad going back even to the early season of Overwatch 1. But actually, things have changed over time. They've refreshed a lot of the tips, and so the question is are these tips actually useful? Now, what I'm not going to be looking at today is judging whether these ability descriptions are accurate. Obviously, telling you what Roadhog's gun done is pretty straightforward. But what I'm going to be looking at is looking for tips that actually help teach you how to play the character, or maybe give you some niche advice that will be useful in understanding what the character's kit does. As you can see, there's some heroes that have some really good tip advice and some characters that have some really, really bad tip advice and a lot in between. Now, I'm not going to bore you with every single tip. I'll link the sheet in the description if you want to see every single tip. But I want to give a general guideline of what tips I found useful, what tips I did not find useful, and more importantly, highlight the ones that I really, really liked and highlight the ones that I really did not like, including stuff that actually has some misinformation in it. Big shout out to Cactus Puppy for digging into the game files and actually finding all these tips. We actually don't know if all these tips are being shown, but that they're in the file. So maybe some of these outdated tips are actually not being shown in game, but they are in the file. So do that with as you will. Also shout out to Braxbro for putting this all together in a Google spreadsheet so we can actually break it down, score it, and show something at the end. Now let's take a look at the spreadsheet. Now I'm going to jump right in here. Showing you guys exactly how it was structured. There's some general tips for just general playstyle that are applied to all characters and just like the general objective of the game. We broke it down into tank tips where there's tips for every single tank, going all the way through again playing versus and playing as the tank, which we were grading on a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being bad misinformation, 5 being wow, that's actually a great tip, and 2, 3, and 4 being somewhere in between. DPS tips and support tips. Now crucially here's the summary, and this is exactly how we made our tier list here, is grading it from a 1 to 5. We went back and then weighted the rankings and then ordered them appropriately in the tier list maker. As you can see, this is the order here: Malga, Echo, Winston, Wrecking Ball, and so on. And what this allowed me to do is kind of get a general idea of not just the trends, but also to highlight the characters that have actually really good tips. Surprisingly, Malga and Soldier 76 had some really, really good playstyle tips. Characters like Symmetra, Baptiste, and Lucio, not so much. Again, if you want to see the details of all of these changes, I'll link the spreadsheet so you guys can sift through those changes. But as for now, let's actually highlight the tips that I found really, really impactful, maybe one for each character, and let's find the tip that was not so useful and what I would be doing instead. So let's start with D.Va here. D.Va, I think, had some really good tips. Overall, I think D.Va had some good basics, but needed some good stuff on space control and awareness, was lacking some stuff on how to position yourself as D.Va. One of the things that did help was using D.Va's boosters to fly around tanks and attack more vulnerable targets, and then attack D.Va's mech from multiple different angles. Definitely some good advice about playing versus D.Va and as D.Va, but I think there could have been a little bit more insight about how to position yourself using high grounds and so on. The bad tip that I didn't like was after your mech is destroyed, fight aggressively with your light gun to charge your ultimate. You actually need to be careful with your light gun with mech, because otherwise your baby D.Va are going to get destroyed pretty quickly. So I found this to be a little bit of misinformation, or at least not worded very well. Moving on to Doomfist here, I think the Doomfist in general has some good stuff on like how the abilities work, like describing the basics, but needed some more tips on how to actually play the character, like what's your play style. The one that was helpful was using all your abilities at once restricts your mobility and makes you vulnerable to counterattacks. That is good for telling you how to play Doomfist, but I think there could have been more insight about using mobility, attacking squishy targets, playing around crowd control. Obviously, tips are very difficult to incorporate, but I think they could have done a better job with that. I also like the meteor strike could get you immediately out of a dangerous situation. So for Junker Queen, I think there was good ability tips. Some tips I really didn't like, though. This one was a little bit more up-to-date, so there was more good stuff. If you're stuck by Jagged Blade, try to get behind terrain to avoid being dragged towards Junker Queen. Really, really good advice for playing versus Junker Queen. But then there was some weird stuff. For example, you were vulnerable for a short duration before charging forward with Rampage. Use Shout before activating your ultimate to protect yourself. That's a very niche tip, and most of the time it's not something you want to be doing. You don't want to be saving Shout to engage with Rampage. It does allow you to go further, but at the same time, it means that you don't have allow the duration of Shout to get out. So I actually think that this is a little bit of misinformation. I would not recommend this for most ultimates. And in addition to that, try to separate Junker Queen from routine to reduce the effectiveness of commanding Shout. I mean, how do you do that? It's not something that's going to be happening. It's not even something that you should be trying to do. So I found Junker Queen tips to be pretty misleading, which is why we gave her a pretty low ranking of only 2.5 out of 5. Moving on to Malga, I think Malga was probably the best character. There's a lot of really insightful stuff, and I think there was an overall trend of newer characters generally having slightly better advice, good tips, good playstyle, and niche ideas that were not obvious, which is exactly what we want here. Highlighting the good here, trapping all your enemies in cage fight might be reckless. Make sure you have the right amount of backup or take the fight one-on-one. That's a really great tip. That's actually something that even higher rank Malgas need to be keeping in mind. Cage fight also hinders anyone trapped inside. Use this to take out more slippery foes. That's really, really nice. Malga's cage fight will trap you in a barrier, but Malga's stuck in there too. If you have more teammates than him, you might stand a chance. This is some decent stuff about how to be playing Malga, how to be using your ultimate, and there's a couple of other tips in here that I found useful as well. No complaints with the Malga tips. Overall, pretty well done. Now, let's move on to Orisa here. Bad tips. We desperately need some cooldown cycle stuff. I found Orisa's tips to be one of the weakest, almost F tier in terms of how useful they were. When you fully charge Terra Surge to deal damage, release early to eliminate low health targets is a good tip for how to use the ultimate. But overall, it found like it was missing a lot of playstyle, like how to cycle your cooldowns. And then this tip right here, while it can be tempting to stay at long range with the augmented fusion driver as a tank, you should try to fight on the objective. You don't always want to be fighting the objective as a tank. Long range with Orisa is actually sometimes decent, but it's more about long range is not good when you're playing versus poke characters. Obviously, there's a lot of details and nuance that doesn't really fit the tip, but I found this to be more misinformation and probably misleading newer players to fight and position incorrectly with Orisa. Even this one, augmented fusion driver can overheat, become unstable. Take advantage of this situation, but watch out for other abilities. Very rarely will that actually be happening, so it's just kind of wasted space and nobody really needs it. So if a tip isn't particularly useful, I think that's a bad tip, because why even have it if it's not really helping anybody? Ramatra, unclear wording on Annihilation extension, but overall good stuff with the playstyle. Again, like there was definitely some effort putting into how do you actually play Ramatra, but I think about activating Annihilation when facing mini enemies. Dealing damage extends its duration. I'm not sure if this tip is still in game. It is still in the files, so it's probably at some point still showing. This is very misleading about like what activates Annihilation, what keeps it going. It's not the damage, it's the sucking damage particularly. So maybe clarifying that it's actually, where is it? It's the swarm. Yeah, the swarm maybe to clarify there. That being said, there's some good tips here about Ravenous Vortex during Annihilation. Sometimes it's better to block during Annihilation and let the swarm finish the enemy off. There's some good advice. Barrier can absorb a lot of damage, but it doesn't last very long. Either overwhelm it or wait for it to expire. These are good tips of how to play versus and how to play as Ramatra. I think this was a good character stuff. Reinhardt one was pretty disappointing. Some niche tips, but nothing really exactly describing playstyle. Like, you could coordinate your team's attack to quickly destroy Ryan's barrier field. That might not be always smart. It might not always be smart to target Ryan when he charges away from his team, because that gives him value when he holds his shield, he distracts you. Using fire strikes against mobile targets such as stun enemies or turrets, sure. Charge stuns Torb's turret. Charge is a devastating follow-up to stunning an enemy with Earthshard. It's not always something you want to be doing. So there was some like basically just describing what the abilities do, but not really giving any sort of insight, and also kind of giving some misleading advice here and there. Pretty mid. One thing I did like is be careful. Even if Reinhardt misses you with charge, you can cancel at any time. That's obviously not something that's not immediately obvious for either playing into the Rhine, and I think that was a good tip overall. But overall, pretty mid. Let's keep going here. So Roadhog, I think Roadhog, good stuff with the playstyle and the micro. The micro felt like it was actually useful, and also general playstyle stuff was good too. I think always looking for opportunities to briefly duck behind cover, try to grab a less mobile hero with your hooks. I think there's a short delay between spewing scrap after acting whole hog, so you try to use it aggressively instead of waiting and you're in low health. I see that all the time in low to mid ranks. Be careful that Roadhog can still use his abilities when he's ulting. Primary Fire has a bigger and more damage projectiles at its center. This is the gun rework, so make sure that you're aiming to land those projectiles and not getting lazy with your shotgun. Some overall good stuff. One tip that I didn't like was the scrap does not hold much ammunition, so try to keep it fully loaded with well-timed reloading. Like, what is that? What is that even doing in there? What does that even mean? It feels like it just takes up space and it doesn't provide anything useful. So I thought Roadhog tips were actually fairly useful. Sigma, not many tips, pretty much all generic. I don't have a whole lot to add there, so we'll keep moving on here. Maybe something about managing your range versus enemy tanks would be useful, but I don't really have anything here. Let's keep going on to Winston. I think Winston was Barrier Projector on the objective. We'll talk about this one. Deploy Barrier Projector on the objective to protect teammates who are contesting it. Man, how about taking space or pressuring squishies? If you're Winston sitting on the objective, your Winston doesn't know how to play Winston. But beyond that, I actually think Winston had some good stuff. Good play style. Don't let Winston distract you from more threatening enemies is one of the most important tips in terms of all of Overwatch 2, because it's so easy to hard focus Winston and just lose to his DPS and supports. I see this all the time, even in higher ranks. It's part of the reason why Winston is one of the most counterpick tanks in the game, because of how easy he is to focus, but that just gives him value a lot of times. So this is a really actually clever tip. I respect that one a lot. This one as well. Winston can move in and out of his barrier projector to keep it between himself and so on. So it's basically teaching you how to bubble dance, moving in and out of the bubble to avoid damage. That's a pretty, very important niche tip, and it's not immediately obvious to lower rank players. So I think Winston had some really good stuff, focusing squishies, stuff like that, directional movement in the air. I think there's some good tips, just a couple of fluff that I would overall try to address. But other than that, I think it was pretty good. Wrecking Ball was okay, but not enough help on the playstyle, like cycling in and out, pressuring, playing around CC, using your minefield on an objective or key choke point, deploy your minefield in the air to spread the mines. Good stuff, but there wasn't enough stuff that was just basically told you, like, what are some combos, but not exactly how to play Wrecking Ball fundamentally. And I actually think that's a pretty easy way to describe it, or there is an easy way to describe it as just roll through, disrupt, distract, use your cooldowns, get in, get out. There's just different ways. It's not a particularly difficult playstyle to understand fundamentally. It might be difficult mechanically to do. I think it might be something to incorporate. But overall, I think Wrecking Ball was okay. And moving on to Zarya here. So Zarya had a lot of stuff here. A lot of weird stuff about disengaging and playing around bubbles and so on. Whereas one of the big tips that I think would be very important for Zarya is to just try to shoot squishies when you can, if otherwise shoot tank, or if you're playing versus Zarya, avoid her when she's charged, take off angles and surround her rather than fighting her head on. I think that's one of Zarya's limitations, but it was just weird stuff. Maybe could use some help also as well when it comes to emphasizing selfish bubbles. There's a lot of talk about like what bubbles can cleanse, what bubbles can counter, how to bubble a teammate, but it's not really like, okay, well, what do I do selfishly as a Zarya? And I think you could talk about how you could use bubbles to help you do more damage and to take space and so on, just blocking damage. But there was some good stuff there as well. Try to avoid damaging Zarya's barriers, but don't let them stop you from finishing off a low health target. I mean, that's great advice playing versus a Zarya right there. Use projected barrier on a teammate whenever you spot them actively engaged in combat. Again, I talk about this all the time when I'm coaching Zaryas. Even Masters GM, being aware of what your teammates and what they're doing and then enabling them whenever you can is really, really important. But again, like I said, I'd like a little bit more emphasis also in selfish value too. If Zarya's weapons become charged with high amounts of energy, consider disengaging for a short time to let it dissipate. Will never happen. Doesn't happen. It's not even necessarily good advice. It's generally better to avoid her rather than to disengage. I think the wording of that needs to be very clear. Graviton Surge can pull enemies away from a map objective, giving your teammate a chance to take the objective uncontested. I mean, you could see 9 people if you pull them away from the objective. An easy way to build energy is to activate particle barrier before moving in front of an enemy turret. Just weird stuff like that. It's like, okay, well, that's not particularly useful. So, okay. Anyway, let's keep moving on here. So the damage characters. I think Ashe the micro was fine. There's some playstyle positioning stuff that could be useful, like taking an angle, taking a sightline. Bob is most disruptive when he charges through the enemy team and fires from behind them. Great advice. Perfect ultimate advice. Very important when you're using that. But at the same time, you can detonate dynamite immediately by shooting it. I gave this a 2 ranking. I think this might be something that might not be immediately obvious to a newer player. So you know what? We'll blankify that. Like I said, we try to remove stuff that was needed to kind of help people understand what the character does. So I'll give that one a thumbs up. Try to use barriers or cover to minimize Bob damage before he leaves. That kind of goes without saying. So there wasn't. I don't really have any real nitpicks with Ashe. Maybe just some stuff that might have been missing. Okay, let's move on to Bastion. Basic. Pretty basic overall, not a lot of stuff about how to play with the character and some misinformation too. Would like some stuff about like taking a medium range sightline and be careful to utilize cover, especially when you're between your turret form, and avoid poking characters from long distances. You know, you're relatively short range. Like Bastion is really fragile from long range. Use assault configuration at location instead of a view of your objective is just such a dumb thing. Like what objective? Like the payload? No, you should be using assault configuration at locations that have a view of your enemy or the enemy tank or something. It's weird. Look for alternate paths to your objective that can avoid Bastion's devastating light of fire. It's weird. Your Ironclad passive allows you to take less damage while reconfigured. Use it defensively. I mean, no, not really. It's just weird advice. So I didn't really find a lot of Bastion stuff to be particularly redeeming. There's also nothing about Bastion's grenade jump, which I think could be a fun little tip that you can include in there. But most of the stuff really desperately missing some playstyle stuff. Okay, I guess Echo, I didn't really have any complaints with Echo. I think overall fine. A couple of things to highlight here. Holding jump when using the flight ability launches you in the air. Sticky bombs, beam combo. Quickly focus attacks on Echo after she uses duplicate. All fine advice. No complaints with Echo. I think it was overall pretty good. Cassidy. So I think lots of weird, outdated advice with Cassidy. I'm going to assume that most of this isn't shown in game, but because it's there, I think we do have to point it out. One thing that I did like was be aware of moving close to Cassidy while his magnetic grenade is available. It's always good to be aware of that. I think that's a fine tip. But then stuff like Cassidy's Peacekeeper is extremely accurate and has very long range. If you can see it, you can shoot it. it's worded so corny with all due respect, but it's also not necessarily accurate, no pun intended. Like the fall off thing, he's actually not very good at long range at all, and it's not even close. And then Peacekeeper's alternate fire quickly shoots the remaining rounds in the weapon, so try to stay fully loaded. What? For what? Reload after every. It's again worded very confusingly, right? Even if there is logic behind what they're trying to say, players are not going to understand that. Try to initiate dead A from behind cover, then move into line of sight afterwards to target enemies. Not always good advice, actually. Sometimes can be useful if you're anticipating CC, but most of the time you're giving the enemy team more time to react. So not necessarily good advice. Okay, moving on to Genji. Again, some weird stuff, but good basics. I think the general basics of how to play the character was good, but like, for example, Genji's mobility allows him to attack from any angle. Use Cyber Agility's mobility to surprise enemies, and so on. But then shurikens are highly accurate even at very long ranges, allowing Genji to attack. No. Genji's a very short-range character. This is not what you want to be encouraging Genjis to do almost ever. Hanzo, some weird tips in here. Some good stuff too. If you must enter an area covered by Hanzo, try to move unpredictably is fine. Hanzo's best sniping locations not only have a great view of the enemy, but good escape routes as well. But then be unpredictable and never stay in one sniping position for too long. Well, watch out for enemy snipers. They're the greatest threat to you. Well, not really. Don't forget to move it makes you harder to hit. Avoid open spaces and areas with long sight lines as you approach your objective. Yeah, there's just some weird tips in here. They don't really line up and may be more bad than good, but yeah. Okay, Junkrat tips were fine. I think Junkrat tips are okay. We'll highlight a couple of good ones. Attack enemies in close areas. Fighting around one of your steel traps can give you an advantage fighting at close range. Use your concussive mind to knock away approaching enemies or knock yourself out of danger. Good advice. No complaints there. Mei, basics were okay. A couple of things that were missing here. Being able to reposition with your wall, cancel cry freeze early to surprise people. That's all fine. Try to single out Mei as so that if she slows you, her teammates cannot take advantage. It's really, again, strange advice. Like the Junker Queen stuff, the whole singling out targets, like you don't do that in Overwatch. Like that's never something that you purposefully do. So it's just not good advice. But yeah, okay. Pharah. Okay. Stuff overall. One really, really bad tip. We'll talk about that. Don't aim your rockets at your target's current location. Aim where you think they will be. Great tip. Don't pass up good opportunities to use barrage while waiting for the perfect one. Great tip. Watch for enemy snipers while airborne. Use jump jets and hover to avoid static enemy defenses and set up ambushes, which is implying more like off-angling and flanking, which is all great. But then take advantage of enclosed spaces to avoid Pharah's long-range aerial attacks. Actually, I understand what they're saying when it comes to like taking cover, but by being in small rooms or enclosed spaces, it's actually the worst solution to Pharah because she's able to AoE splash you and she gets the verticality above you. Do not go inside rooms versus Pharah. It's not good. It's not good almost ever. You really want to be out in open sight lines, certainly with cover, but yeah, some form of open sight line when there's like a longer distance between you. Pharah's usually, if you have any sort of poke or any sort of hit scan, you do not want to be inside. So, okay. Reaper, some great tips and some really bad tips. One of the great tips, use Deathblock when the enemy teams are distracted. When approaching an enemy unaware, don't open fire too soon. Great. When a Reaper's on the enemy team, watch for them to attack you from above and behind. Use Shadow Step to attack the enemy from unexpected directions. Surprise and flank enemies. Yeah, all the great Reaper playstyle stuff, right? There's not a lot of here just focusing just tank outside of this one, which is whatever. But then be careful when using Wraith form, as you could find yourself in a situation with no way out. It's such a total why? Why is that even there? What does it even mean? It doesn't really give you any insight about how to play, and it could be more confusing than anything else. Reaper's most effective at very close range. Keep him at a distance. I guess I didn't really have a problem with this tip. It's pretty self-explanatory, but sure. The best counter to Reaper Death Blossom is to stun or kill him. Okay, I mean, I guess, I'm being a little nitpicky. I think these are relatively okay, but not necessarily the most useful or impactful tips. But it was okay. I'm kind of splitting hairs here. Sojourn, inoffensive, so no real problems. One thing I'll point out, once detonating Disruptor Shot, damage cannot be blocked by enemy barriers. Crucially, use it to force enemies to reposition is a good tip of how to play Sojourn. Seems fine. Maybe we could do some playstyle stuff about how to use her, build rail, look for rails. It was a little bit missing in that department, but it was okay. Soldier, some really good tips here, actually, and actually not really any bad tips. The one that I really liked was use Tactical Visor when your enemies are unaware of your location. They'll have less time to seek cover, use defensive abilities. Seek cover if you're caught in the open versus Visor. Do try to kill them. Lower rank players tend to panic even if they're in the open. You just need to try and kill them. Sprint isn't just used for getting back into the fight after you respawn. It's a flexible tool for repositioning. So short bursts with heavy pulse rifle. I think Soldier 76, if I remember correctly, the second most useful character when it came to tips. So I respect that one really well. That was good. Sombra was fine. Nothing really major with Sombra. If a particular enemy hero is countering your team's composition, prioritize hacking that hero. It's not really that good advice. You need to be thinking more about like who can I assassinate? Is hacking that character even good? Some characters are not that useful or even not very easy to hack. A couple of good things like use your translocator to reach areas of the map that allow you to engage from unexpected angles. Try to hack enemies from directions they don't expect. Change directions. There's some useful stuff here, but not super useful. When Sombra hacks you, you're revealed to all enemies. Stay close to your team. Is again not necessarily good advice when you're playing versus Sombra. It depends on the situation and depends on the character, but that's not necessarily good beginner advice. Symmetra, really quite bad. Some outdated, weird stuff and no real guidance on playstyle, like how to use teleporter for yourself. I think that there's a little bit of spookiness about like, oh, we don't want to use teleporter for like team play stuff because it never happens in rank, but there's no guidance about how to use teleporter by yourself or to take angles or to take positions at all. And I think that's a relatively easy stuff to describe. Keep your center turrets out of view. Use photon barrier to protect yourself from snipers as they approach the objective. Is a weird wording, but I appreciate the attempt there. A single center turret is not much of a threat, but several of them together creates a deadly trap. Well, that's outdated. You generally, Symmetra, it's smarter to spread your turrets in most situations because the damage itself is not that good, but the scouting information / space control is. When placing your teleporter, use locations near your current objective but hidden from the enemy. Again, you might not want teleporter to be near your objective, and generally it just often isn't. So again, is it talking about the objective, like the payload, or objectives and what you want to do? Not great advice. It's going to be very confusing. Let's see here. Tracer, some good stuff, some not. I think stuff about let your teammates create a distraction before you enter combat is a great tip, but then have Link or Recall ready to avoid being killed by your own pulse bomb. Like, what? It's such a weird tip. I guess if you kill yourself with pulse bomb, you go, oh, but you don't need the tip to tell you that after you kill yourself with the pulse. I mean, if you're brand new to Overwatch, you'll be like, oh, okay, well, I think you figured out without a tip telling you. Use Tracer's mobility to quickly reach health packs loaded across the map. Tracer excels at skirmishing. Avoid fights where the odds are not in your favor. What does skirmishing mean? I think I understand what skirmishing means, but the average player is not going to understand what skirmishing means, so it's a useless tip. Speed is the key to your survival, so beware of heroes with crowd control like Mei and Sombra. Again, no, Tracer just relatively well versus those characters, and it's not the crowd control of those characters that really bothers you too much. Stay near your teammates, avoid being singled out by Tracer is a mixed bag. Crowd control abilities like Chain Hook and Ursa's are very effective against Tracer. Again, mixed bag. Heroes with weapons that do not rely on accuracy, such as Winston, can be problematic for Tracer. Torbjorn's problematic for Tracer, but Winston is not. Winston is actually does struggles with Tracer sometimes. So again, mixed bag there. Some stuff that's not particularly useful. Torbjorn, some really dumb stuff, some really good stuff. Stacking lava is not good. Target enemy heroes that have limited mobility with your lava. Your turret automatically targets enemies you hit with your gun. Again, not obvious stuff, good stuff. But then turret can be stunned by abilities such as Reinhardt's Charge. Well, thank you for that. Barriers can protect enemies from a turret's damage for a short time. Wow, that is so helpful. Thank you so much. But yeah, not particularly useful. Venture tips, newer characters, so Venture's tips are going to be relatively more useful. Tectonic Shock has surprising reach. That's a good tip, and it does. Stay in the air behind cover to avoid taking damage. Yep. Burrow and Drill Dash to get behind enemy lines and set up ambushes. Playstyle, great stuff. Yeah, most of the stuff is pretty straightforward, and overall, again, newer characters, so generally has more helpful advice. Widowmaker, I think some good stuff, some not some good stuff. Vitamine along attacker's path can warn you of an approaching threat. It's fine. If you enter an area covered by Widowmaker, try to move unpredictably. Good. Vision is highly restricted while sniping. Listen for incoming threats. Grappling Hook isn't just for reaching locations. You can use it on the floor to quickly move short distances. Unpredictable, never stay in one sniping position for too long. Lots of good playstyle stuff here. But don't forget to move as you aim. It makes you harder to hit. Very situational, and actually probably one of the worst characters to give that advice for. So I think that's probably something that I would not put in the tip. Okay, let's move along to support tips. And a lot of the support tips, frankly, were really not that good. I'm getting my notes here pulled up. Yeah, so let's start with Ana. Feels out of date and very worded weirdly. So like, let's say, look at this one. Your vision is highly restricted while sniping, but you can still listen for an incoming threats is good advice. But then use your sleep dart and enemy ambushers to allow you to get to safety. Vague wording, enemy ambushers. How about we just say enemies that will push you, or dive threats? Maybe people don't know what dive is. On threats, pushing or trying to kill you. Just basically using the wording to not include enemy ambushers. That seems weird. Maybe I'm, being nitpicky. But this one is really kind of bleh. Stay unpredictable, never remain in one sniping position for too long is not really something that Ana should be doing. So again, it just feels a little bit outdated with some of these tips. Baptiste, Let's see here. Super generic and lame tips. Awful. Embarrassing. Call the cops is my, are my notes. I don't really have much good to say about Bap. Baptiste cannot heal himself without his regenerative burst, so try to pressure him after he uses this ability is fine. Use corners and cover to protect yourself from immortality field, or protect your immortality field. Again, fine. But then use Amp Matrix in emergency situations for increased healing is like okay, but generally that's not what you're looking to use your amplification matrix for. Long cooldown, so try to save it for important moments. It's just like really basic stuff. Try to combo matrix with high damage projectiles is not necessarily always good advice. Be careful when you reload to make sure you won't need to heal your allies during that time. Again, weird advice. Try to destroy immortality field quickly. Try to knock enemies out of immortality field. Be careful in trying to attack enemies that are firing. It's either like super obvious even for new players or just oddly basic. There's a huge lack of detail here. And I think maybe if I'm splitting hairs here, generally Baptiste's stuff was just pretty bleh and felt a little outdated. Brigitte, also super generic and missing stuff I have on notes. Okay, let's take a look here. So use Whip Shot to push deadly short-range characters like Reaper to safer distance is good. But then stuff like Brig can knock back enemies into dangerous situations with both Whip Shot and Shield Bash. Not with Shield Bash. Shield Bash is a cancel. It's not really a knockback. Concentrate Fire to focus the barrier shield. Maybe. Before your barrier shield breaks, Shield Bash to quickly escape. Sure, I guess. Maybe I won't get this one at a 2. That one's okay. Use Barrier Shield to give yourself cover, then use Shield Bash to quickly enter Rocket Flow range. Again, there's not a lot of clarity about like how to play Brigitte here, about how to help control short sight lines, but don't brawl with the enemy tank. Just because you're tanky here doesn't mean that you want to play close to everything but the enemy tank. Like there's some stuff it's more of like it's crime through a mission more than anything else. But yeah, pretty mid with Brig. Nothing particularly criminal, but yeah. Idiari. Solid, could use some gameplay context about how you kind of hold off angles and shoot. There's a lot of tips here, but nothing really how to like play Iliari. Captive Spuns spread out. That's a great tip. Even people today still don't know that about the chain reaction. Destroy the pylon before facing her is a good idea. Let's see here. To surprise enemies, reposition yourself with outburst before. That's a pretty cool tip. Before fully depleting your solar energy means that it takes you a longer time to get your heal beam. That is a good tip, good advice. Weird one here is to shoot your solar rifle when it's fully charged to deal maximum damage. This one's worded confusingly. It should be maximum damage per second or something like that because maximum damage output or whatever, or something, because it's obviously fully charge my gun to do max damage. But it's not that. It's actually higher DPS to fully charge. So this is a good tip, but it's very confusingly worded, and I don't think it actually gets to the point it's trying to convey. Kiriko is good. Could use some gameplay context about taking angles and helping flanks and kind of flanking. This one was good, though. Kunai normally deal low damage, but have a high critical damage multiplier. Aim for the head whenever possible is good advice. But generally, playstyle stuff could be using. Lifeweaver, I actually had no real complaints with Lifeweaver. Thought it was good. Positioning stuff and playstyle stuff was relatively safe. It was totally fine. Catapulting yourself with Petal Platform. Use the range of Healing Blossom and Verticality Petal Platform to find safe positions to heal from is good advice about how to play the character. One thing that I think would be a little weird was Petal Platform enables enemies to post up in high locations. Be wary of death from above. Doesn't happen all that often. I'm mostly being nitpicky with this one, but I just found it funny. Lucio one. Lucio might have been the worst. Lucio might have been the worst. There was a lot of misinformation with Lucio and very outdated. Not a whole lot of good things to say. Moving around the battlefield was fine. You can use Amp Heal. You can use Amp Speed. When using Speed Boost to run back into respawning, don't forget your teammates is all like fine. But this stuff like the Sonic Amplifier is accurate, but its damage is low, and its projectiles can be dodged. Its projectiles can be dodged, and it's accurate? Like, do you mean like there's no fall off, or there's no arc, or there's no... But again, it's the same thing with the Genji thing. It's not clear, and it's very confusing how it's worded. Don't try to fight the enemy team alone. Stay with your team and move as a unit is situational advice. In fact, a lot of low-ranked Lucios are way too team-oriented, and not team-oriented, but too clump main group-oriented. Don't use their wall riding enough. I think there could be a huge tip here about try to work on your wall riding or your verticality or move around the map to avoid enemy projectiles or something like that. And there's nothing about that. As a support hero, Lucio is always a high-priority target. It's just false. Like, Lucio is generally one of the more difficult targets to kill. Generally, Lucio is not a very high often priority target. Have enemy heroes near you is dangerous. Use Soundwave to push them away. It depends on the character. Lucio is a pretty short range support, so he actually wants to get close to most of the cast. That's not a tank. So again, just some weird outdated tips here. Mercy. Overall, okay, but some real bad tips. Use Valkyrie proactively to make coordinated attacks by your teammate more effective is a good tip. There's a lot of other stuff like this, but long fights favor Mercy and her healing ability. Be aggressive and trying to finish off enemies quickly. No, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Weird, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Don't forget about your Caduceus Blaster. It is accurate. What? No, it's not. It's slow. It's a very slow projectile. Target Mercy first. It keeps her from using Resurrect, and she's often more vulnerable than the rest of your team. Sure, but honestly, this is something that you should target Mercy if possible, but don't always target Mercy first. She's actually one of the slipperier supports, and it's not always smart to focus her down. In fact, it's usually not good to focus her down. Be careful when taking on Mercy while you have low health. Can do a surprising amount of damage. Is a classic one. Mercy can launch herself in different directions during Guardian Angel. She is most vulnerable when separated from her allies. That's not a bad tip, but it's not super, super useful. And how do you separate her from her allies? So anyway, mostly nitpicking there, but that's kind of why we're here, no? Last couple here, let's take a look here. Moira, pretty generic. Okay, nothing really inoffensive with the Moira. I'm not going to really point out anything here. Use Faye to quickly move to injured teammates who need biotic grass peeling is situational. It can often just put you at risk as well. So I'm not so sure how I feel about that tip. Zenyatta, I think solid overall. Keep your enemies at a healthy distance. Use Transcendence to save yourself, and then retreat to your team. When in melee range using Snap Kick. I don't actually have any complaints about how Zen was done. I think Zen was overall one of the better ones. So overall, we'll take a quick look at the tier list here. Like overall, I think there was a lot of characters that did a pretty good job, but I think the biggest thing is there were some characters that needed more play style, like how do you actually play the character, and there were some spatterings of misinformation through. I do think that in general, if you can look at the trend here, with the exception of Junker Queen and some of the reworked Orisa Bastion stuff, overall, a lot of these characters do have a lot of good advice and newer stuff, Malga, even stuff like the Roadhog rework. There was definitely a lot of thought put into the tips, and that definitely helps the new characters understand, or new players to understand exactly how to play the reworked Roadhog. And obviously, I am coming this from the perspective of being a coach, and not everyone has the same level of insight because of what I do for work. However, I do think that even for brand new beginner players, I think there's some of these tips that could be improved. Maybe that's something that our next community project is to kind of crack out, like what would we replace them with. I offered some suggestions, but obviously wording things to the tips is tricky. My recommendation, I would probably turn tips off if you're not a brand new player to the game, but I would leave tips on if you are a brand new player to the game. I think that there's a lot to learn from the tips if you keep them on, but at a certain point when you start to be like, I know, then at that point you should probably turn them off because at that point they're not like providing any value. Anyway, let me know what you guys think. Am I being too nitpicky? What would you guys prefer to have in the tip system? Is there a better way to do it? What would you think is missing from the overall tip system overall?